Now, PE, permanent establishment, has always been a big issue in fund structuring, and we take a lot of care while setting up the structure, in terms of having the offshore fund manager, the onshore advisory company, to address a potential PE risks. We want to ensure that the advisory company is not an agent. So a lot of care is taken. Now the budget has proposed that presence of fund managers in India may not create a permanent establishment. So question to Shreya, does this provide real relief, and what's the extent of this relief?
It would probably be appropriate to ask that question for a number of amendments in this budget, but I think so this is a really well-intentioned kind of amendment, right? And here again, I think what it indicates is that the finance ministry is trying to be in sync with international globally accepted practices. So for example, in the UK, they have a similar exemption for fund managers, which they have in place to incentivize fund managers to come and operate out of the UK. And I think several representations were made to the ministry on the PE exemption for fund managers, because today the way funds operate under India's treaties, the presence of fund managers in India can create a tax presence for funds in India. So what most funds will do is that if they do require fund managers on ground, they will instead enter into advisory kinds of arrangements with them, where it will only be advisory activity that takes place in India, with the final decision-making activity taking place outside India. And I think the intention here was to encourage people to have decision makers also sitting in India. But the way they've done it is, firstly, they've made this a very restrictive kind of exemption, and it would probably be impossible for private equity funds to satisfy most of these conditions. FPIs will have a slightly easier time, but again not a much easier time. And to an extent, we also need to look at whether this is really useful for FPIs. Firstly, because FPI income based on the last time's budget is categorized as capital gains. So there's a limit to which it would be exposed to a permanent establishment risk in India. And secondly, FPIs often have co-location servers in India, which is really what creates permanent establishment risk. So I think it may be useful to run through some of the conditions that they've put down in this law. The first thing that they've said is that to be an eligible investment fund that is entitled to this benefit, it needs to have a minimum of 25 members. Now here again, they've not indicated whether this will be applied on a look-through basis or whether it will be only at the fund level. So for example, if you have a master feeder kind of structure, would this benefit really be available even if you have 25 members, which a lot of funds may not, particularly if they have institutional investors.
So typically this will be an issue for a lot of US funds who are raising funds from taxable and tax exempt investors.
Yeah.
But the tax exempt investors come at Cayman corporation level, and the taxable investors come at Delaware LP level.
Correct.
And then both the Delaware and the Cayman feeders, they feed into Mauritius master.
Yeah.
So whether Mauritius master will be considered just to have 2 investors, or on a look-through basis 25 investors. So that's the clarity which has not been given in the...
which is missing right now. And that is even if they have 25 members in the US, which often may not happen.
Right.
Now the second thing that they've done is that they've imposed thresholds in respect of how much each of these investors can put in. So they've said that no investor can commit more than 10%, and the aggregate of your top 10 should be less than 50%, right? Now here again, if you have a sponsor or an anchor investor who wants to put in excess of that 10%, you would not have that being qualified as an eligible fund.
In fact, it is becoming very important because we are dealing with a lot of clients who are right now on the road for raising funds.
Yeah.
And one of the most important thing they are saying is that the success to fundraising in the current environment is to first get an anchor investor.
Yeah.
Which means that anchor investor will commit at least maybe anything between 10 to 30% of the fund corpus, based on which the other investors will be willing to invest in the fund. Now this limit of 10% itself is very less when it comes to anchor investors. So the funds which are currently being raised, it will be very difficult for them to satisfy this test.
And especially in the early stage,
yeah,
you know,
correct.
Investors.
Early stage, or let's say even the first time fund managers, you know, lot of first time fund managers are on road.
Yeah.
For them, this condition is going to be very difficult to justify. And
Also
especially a
for
lot of these
foreign,
first time fund managers are all Indian GPs.
Yeah.
So for them, this exemption becomes all the more important.
Also for foreign family offices might become a bit issue, possibly.
Yeah. If they have Indian presence, yeah.
So I think the third condition, again very difficult for PE funds, is that they've said that the eligible investment fund should not control or manage any business in India, right? Now, again, they have not really mentioned what this means. So, for example, if you have very strong affirmative rights, is that control and management? If you have a director on the board of the Indian company, could that be considered control and management? If you have veto rights, for example, all of that is not really clear under the current law. So particularly in a PE kind of context where it is expected that the investor will come in with some degree of management expertise, how is this really going to impact the exemption?
In fact, there are a lot of other laws which now have a consistent definition of control.
Yeah.
If you look at FDI policy, Competition Act, Takeover Code and Companies Act, the definition of control has been aligned. And one of the issues which a lot of investors are facing is whether, as you rightly mentioned, whether some of the operational veto rights like participating in the business plan, annual business plan of the company, or appointing a CEO or CFO of the company, whether these would be considered as control for the purpose of those legislations. That is one. The other issue which we are also seeing is there are a lot of buyout funds who are getting more and more interested in India. And all these buyout funds typically will take a controlling stake in Indian company. Now, given the fact that these funds will take controlling stake in Indian companies, they will never be able to satisfy this criteria that the fund does not control the portfolio company. So, this is again something which is not going to help the buyout funds.
Yeah. And I think the fourth, I mean, of course, there are several criteria, but the fourth key criteria is that they've said that the eligible fund manager can't be an employee of the fund. So, I mean, I think particularly if you're looking at people managing your fund, you're not going to, the possibility of your hiring someone completely independent are not very high. But they've introduced this carve out for employees and connected persons. So I think that's
so cannot be an employee of the fund or any connected person.
Exactly.
Would it not even better to simply say that any fund that is registered under the FPI regime with SEBI or under AIF regime with SEBI, you know, would not cause any, you know, why they have to go into all this kind of things, right? A little unfortunate, but I would not.
In fact, there are a couple of other more issues. So, what Shreya, you mentioned are the eligibility conditions for the fund.
Yeah.
But there are also certain conditions for the fund manager.
Yeah.
And one of the conditions is that the fund manager should be registered as an investment advisor in India.
Yeah, that's
now,
true.
interesting thing is that under the investment advisor regulations, if you are advising a foreign client, which means if you are advising a foreign manager or a foreign fund, then there is an exemption available under the investment advisor regulations. So, on one hand, SEBI is exempting you from being registered as an investment advisor. On the other hand, the tax laws may require you to get registered. The other issue is, is that one of the other provisions that they have mentioned is that the fund manager should not be earning more than 20% of the profits of the fund.
Yeah.
Now, typically, as we know, 220 or 1.520 have become the standard norm for the fund managers in the form of management fee and carry. Now, fund manager is on one hand earning 2% management fee and 20% carry, which is the share of the profits of the fund.
Yeah.
But at times, and it's now becoming more and more important, is for the LPs are asking for more skin in the game for the GPs. So the GPs are not only acting as GPs, but they also have to be LPs in the fund, which means because they are LPs, the profit which they are deriving from the fund will be in excess of 20%.
Yeah.
Because it's not only 20% profit as GP, but even additional profit which they get as LP, which means again they will not be able to satisfy this requirement.
Yeah.
Another thing they have also said is that the fund should pay arm's length fees to the manager in India. Now again, this is very important because in all the structures that are set up, the manager never advises or manages the offshore fund directly. It's always through an offshore manager who in turn is managing the offshore fund.
Yeah.
In which case will this fall foul of the requirement of arm's length fees being paid by the fund to the manager.
Yeah.
So given there are so many conditions which the FM has introduced, I doubt if any fund will be able to claim this exemption because most of the conditions, I mean one more condition which even though somebody wants to satisfy, they need to understand what it means. Like they have said the average monthly corpus of the fund should be at least 100 crore.
Yeah.
Now corpus is fine, but what does average monthly corpus mean? So I think more clarification is needed from the government on this. So broadly I think these have been the challenges.
So private equity funds have not been covered, I think. That's simply the way in which conditions
I think all types of fund, private equity or FPIs,
so
the conditions are so draconian that it will be very difficult to satisfy each of these conditions.
So essentially well intentioned, but it's almost
lost in the
redundant.
fine print.
It's almost non-starter then, you know.
Yeah.
Lost in the fine print.
Right.
Okay.